The book of Joshua shatters the polite postcard version of the Bible. It is not a cozy campfire tale. It is a war ledger written like liturgy, a courtroom drama wrapped inside battle reports, a coronation ceremony that begins with a funeral and ends with 3 graves. And inside its stone-hard pages sits a revelation that flips the story of Scripture on its head. The man leading the charge is named Yehoshua. Joshua, meaning YHWH, is salvation. In Greek, the name reads Iesus, the same letters used later for Jesus of Nazareth. The book's very title is a whisper that becomes a thunderclap. The stage opens at the lip of the Jordan River in full flood. It is early spring, barley season, around the 10th day of the first month, a detail tucked into Joshua 4 and 5. The river roars wider than normal, a barrier swollen to make crossing laughable. Behind Joshua stands a generation, born under open skies, raised on manna and memory. Before him lies a land thick with fortified cities, iron chariots, and giants with names that drift like smoke from ancient campfires. Anak, Talmai, Sheshai. The last time Israel stood at the edge of destiny, the people panicked and bought 40 years of sand and funerals. Not this time. The ark goes first. Priests step in, shoulders sunk beneath the weight of the gold-covered chest that signals the presence of the holy. The river peels back in an instant, and the water piles up far to the north, near a place called Adam by Zarethan. It does not flow backward. It does not trickle. It halts as if struck dumb. The nation walks through on dry ground. The God who crushed the Red Sea in Exodus does it again at the Jordan for a new generation. On their way out, Joshua appoints 12 stones, 1 for each tribe, lifted from the riverbed to build a memorial at Gilgal. Children will touch the stones and trace the family story with their fingers. Elders will name the day the river heard the voice of God and stopped. And then everything slows. Before a single battering ram touches a single gate, Israel undergoes surgery in the open air. Every uncircumcised male is cut at Gibeath Haraloth, the hill of foreskins. Because covenant comes before conquest. The manna that fell daily for 40 years stops the next day after they taste Canaan's grain. The diet changes because the destiny has changed. The night before Jericho, Joshua meets a sword-bearing figure who calls himself the commander of the Lord's army. Sandals off. Holy ground. The same instruction that met Moses at Horeb meets Joshua outside Jericho. The leadership mantle sits on his shoulders now. Jericho locks its gates. No one in, no one out. The battle plan reads like theater because it is theater. 7 priests. 7 ram's horns. The ark at the center. Silent ranks. March once daily for 6 days. On the 7th day, circle the city 7 times. At the signal, blast the horns and shout. The strategy is worship, not siegecraft. This is not normal warfare. This is covenant warfare. Archaeology shakes hands with this story and then argues in circles. Mid-20th century excavations led by Kathleen Kenyon redated Jericho's big destruction to around 1550 BCE, 2 centuries before a late 13th century conquest chronology, and she saw no city wall to match Joshua's time. Her conclusion turned textbooks. A later voice, Bryant Wood, re-examined pottery, scarabs and grain storage jars, and pushed the destruction closer to 1400 BCE, matching an early date chronology derived from 1 Kings 6:1. He pointed to collapsed mud brick that formed a ramp, charred layers, and full grain bins that match a short siege in spring. Jericho became a case study in how one tells time with broken pots and burned wheat. The debate still hums, because dirt does not speak in unison, but the Bible's narrative never blinks. The walls fell flat. Rahab's house in the wall stood. The city was devoted to destruction under Hiram, the ban, a technical term of holy judgment. The firstfruit city was not for plunder. The cursed city was not for rebuilding. And centuries later, in 1 Kings 16:34, a man named Hiel of Bethel lost his firstborn and his youngest when he rebuilt Jericho's foundations and gates, like clockwork, fulfilling Joshua's curse. Rahab the harlot survives with her family because faith hangs a scarlet cord in a window. Her past does not cancel her future. She becomes part of Israel. Later, she appears in a royal genealogy in Matthew 1, tied by blood to David and to Jesus. In a chapter about judgment, a Canaanite woman stands as a trophy of mercy. The book never lets the story flatten into caricature. Jericho falls without a sword fight described. The sound of ram's horns punches the air, the shout surges, and the walls collapse. Israel burns the city and saves Rahab. But shallow victories rot fast. The next town is Ai. Small, mockable. Israel rushes in with 3,000 men and comes back gasping, bodies on the road. Something is wrong. The leadership tears its clothes. The problem is not military. The problem is moral. A man from Judah named Achan had taken a beautiful Babylonian garment, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold, items under Hiram, sacred to God, reserved for him alone, not for personal closets. Guilt in a hidden tent flips an entire battle. The narrative drills into personal sin that blasts into public consequence, a moral physics that exposes the soul of this book. Judgment falls in the valley of Achor. The household stands in the circle of stones. The memory burns permanently. The name of the valley brands the earth with ache and warning. With sin addressed, strategy returns. Joshua sets a trap for Ai, an ambush to the west, a feint to the east. Ai empties its city to chase Israel, turns its back, and sees smoke rise as its gate burns. The army turns, the ambushers close, and the city collapses. The sequence pivots to worship again. At Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, Joshua builds an altar of uncut stones, writes a copy of the law on plaster, and presides over a reading of blessings and curses. Half the nation stands on one slope, half on the other, and the priests elevate the ark in the valley between. The scene bolts Deuteronomy's vision into reality. The land echoes with covenant words. The radical point lands hard. War in Joshua is never severed from worship. Law anchors steel. Obedience guides the sword. Modern spades crash into this moment as well. In the 1980s, Adam Zertel surveyed Mount Ebal and announced a rectangular structure with a ramp, layers of unhewn stones, altars within altars, and masses of burned animal bones from clean species. The find lined up with Deuteronomy's commands about uncut stones and plaster. Some archaeologists dismissed the identification as a watchtower or a farmhouse. Others saw a place that matches Moses' blueprints and Joshua's actions. In 2022, a team publicized a small lead tablet from the site with a proposed 13th century inscription invoking YHWH and containing curse formulae. The reading remains heavily debated because epigraphy on corroded lead strains, eyesight, and patience. The conversation continues, and Ebal refuses to go quiet. Back on the plains, newcomers approach Israel with cracked wineskins, patched sandals, and moldy bread. They present themselves as distant travelers. They stand humble and hungry. They seek a treaty. Israel signs. The narrative slides one sentence like a knife. Israel did not ask the Lord's counsel. A few days later, the lie falls apart. The men were from Gibeon, a league of cities only a few miles away. The oath still binds. Gibeon lives as woodcutters and water carriers for the altar. Mercy is messy here. The people grumble. The leaders hold the line. Keeping covenant in a world of deception costs pride but saves the soul of a nation. The Gibeonite oath brings war anyway. 5 kings in the south rally to punish Gibeon for defecting. The coalition swarms to the Gibeon Plateau. Israel marches all night from Gilgal, uphill, into enemy shadows. The battle bursts open in a cascade of the unexpected. Panic hits the enemy. Bodies fall to swords and to hail. The text tracks a statistic that tightens the throat. More died from the hailstones than by the sword of Israel. Cosmic weather patterns enter the field like shock troops. Then Joshua speaks to YHWH in the sight of Israel, and the day stretches long. The text claims the sun stood still over Gibeon and the moon over Aijalon. The ancient record cites a source now lost to common shelves, the Book of Jashar. The passage invites debate, like metal invites magnetism. Some read a literal astronomical miracle. Others see ancient Near Eastern war poetry that announces a day without hurry and a victory without dusk. Either way, the narrative speaks with authority and stamps the moment. YHWH fights for Israel. 5 kings flee to a cave at Makkedah. Stones roll against the mouth until the battle ends. Then the kings are brought out, executed, hung on trees until evening, and returned to the cave. Stones roll again, a witness pile, sealing judgment into the hillside. The pattern appears again and again. Stones speak in Joshua. Southern Canaan buckles under this pressure. Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, Debir, names that become lines of subdued text in victory lists. A king of Gezer tries to intervene at Lachish and goes down. Horses are hamstrung. Chariots are burned. Warfare changes when enemies rely on technology, and you neutralize it obediently. The campaign arcs north later, where Hazor stands like a crown on a hill above the Hule Basin, the head of all those kingdoms. Jabin rules there in Joshua's time, a dynasty name that reappears in Judges. Forces assemble like a sandstorm, with horses and chariots as many as the sands of the seashore. Flames, and the chapter. Joshua burns Hazor. Some cities are left standing for inheritance. Azori is singled out for fire. Archaeology again draws lines on maps with charcoal. At Hazorah, a destruction layer sits in late Bronze Age too, with charred palaces, smashed cult statues, and a violence that leaves ash in the seams of the earth. Who did it and when becomes a museum argument. The Bible's claim points its own direction, and the dirt speaks with heat even when the lecture hall smolders with disagreement. The narrative pauses on this phrase, "The land had rest from war." 12 chapters funnel to that breath. But the text also lowers another line like a plumb. Much of the land remains to be possessed. Both lines are true at once, and the tension defines the next 7 books of the Bible. Now the story slows to a pace modern readers often rush past. The allotment of the land is not filler. It is the whole point. The point was never trophies and burnt gates. The point is families on vineyards and flocks on hills. The point is rest. Shiloh rises in the center as the place where the tabernacle settles. Lots are cast before the Lord. Lines mark Judah, Ephraim, Manasseh. The geography reads like a love letter to place. Springs and valleys and ridges and towns, named in precise clusters. Caleb steps forward, the man who at 40 believed and at 85 still asks for hard ground. He receives Hebron, long home of the Anakim. Othniel, who will one day judge Israel, takes Debir and marries Aksah, who asks for springs and receives the upper and the lower. The writer is kind to this girl who knows how to ask for water in a dry land. Judah receives a vast south with desert rim and hill country. Ephraim and Manasseh receive a central spine of highland. Dan will struggle for coastal lowland against iron chariots and will later slip north to Laish. Benjamin's strip will cradle Jerusalem, a city not fully held yet. The Jebusites live with Judah and Benjamin until David's day. Gezer stays Canaanite until Solomon's father-in-law from Egypt burns it and gives it as a dowry. Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, Philistine Pentapolis along the coast still loom like iron teeth waiting for Samson and David. The lists acknowledge enemies in the margins. The book is not propaganda. It is sober and clear. Rest does not erase resistance overnight. Israel's legal system receives backbone in this quiet section. Cities of refuge dot the map. Kedesh in Galilee, Shechem in Ephraim, Hebron in Judah, Bezer in the wilderness east of the Jordan, Ramoth in Gilead, and Golan in Bashan. A man who kills without malice runs there and waits for trial with the congregation. The avenger of blood cannot shortcut justice. The murderer cannot hide within city walls either. He faces death after fair testimony. The manslayer lives in the city until the death of the high priest and then returns home. The system marches mercy and justice hand in hand. 48 Levitical cities scatter across the land like salt. Because the tribe of Levi receives no territorial slice, God is their inheritance. Their scattering places teachers and priests within reach of every family. The nation becomes a network rather than a cluster of fortresses. Then, a civil war almost breaks out. The eastern tribes, Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, had asked Moses for land east of the Jordan and had fulfilled their pledge to fight in Canaan. They return home with blessing. At the border, they build a massive altar. News reaches Shiloh. The western tribes surge toward war because an altar outside the appointed sanctuary signals apostasy. Holy memory remembers Peor and the plague and vows never to repeat it. A delegation forms with Phinehas, the same zealot priest whose spear ended spiritual rot in Numbers 25. He leads a conversation rather than a charge. The eastern tribes explain. The altar is not for sacrifices. It is a witness, a sign, a replica, so the tribal descendants will not forget that YHWH is God of both sides of the river. The complaint evaporates into relief. War sheaths its blade. The altar receives a name meaning witness. Unity survives because zeal for holiness and patience for truth walk together. The book begins to feel like the last pages of a sailor's log. Joshua grows old. He exhorts leaders to cling to the law, to refuse compromise, and to refuse intermarriage that trades away worship. He warns that blessing and curse still sit on the table. He repeats the promise. Not one word of all God's good words has failed. The book he carries in his hand matters. Meditation is not a quiet hobby. It is a battle discipline. He gathers the nation at Shechem, a place thick with memory. Abraham built an altar there centuries earlier. Jacob buried idols under a terebinth there and named the place El Elohi Israel. Between the shoulders of Ebal and Gerizim, Joshua recites history from Abraham's fathers who served other gods, to the Exodus to the land they now stand on. He draws a line in the dust and calls for allegiance. The people respond with zeal. He writes their words in the book and sets a great stone under an oak by the sanctuary. The stone, he says, has heard every vow, because everything in Joshua witnesses. The memory of that stone fuses with the land. The ending arrives without fanfare, but with gravity. Joshua dies at 110 and is buried at Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim. They bury the bones of Joseph, carried out of Egypt generations earlier. At Shechem, in the plot Jacob bought with silver, Eleazar the priest, son of Aaron, dies as well and is buried in the hill country of Ephraim, in the lot of his son Phinehas. The narrative closes with 3 graves. The promise to the patriarchs roots in soil. The Exodus lands in a tomb that is finally at home. Leadership passes quietly into the era that follows. The land lies in covenant balance. The book exhales. Joshua's name hums through the story. Yehoshua, HWH saves. The nation enters through a leader with that name. Centuries later, a greater Yehoshua leads a different exodus and a different crossing. The New Testament letter to the Hebrews even teases this tension, saying Joshua gave a kind of rest, but another rest still remains open. Joshua's battles and boundaries enact a sketch that fills out later. The commander of the Lord's army that told Joshua to take off his sandals resembles more than an angel. The boundaries, the altar, the cities of refuge, the law on plaster, the written covenant, and the stone witness hum together like a chord stacking themes. To understand the controversies around Joshua, the clock must be held in both hands. Two major date frameworks lock horns. An early date for the conquest lands around 1406K, based on adding the 480 years in 1 Kings 6K1, back from Solomon's 4th year, around 966 BCE, and lining that with the 40 years of wilderness wandering. An alternative late date lands around 1230 to 1228 BCE, aligning with the Merneptah stele from around 128 BCE that boasts of Israel being laid waste in Canaan, implying Israel's presence by that time. Jericho's excavations created fault lines. Kenyon's 1950s conclusions removed a city at 1200 BCE but found a massive destruction around 1550 BCE. Wood's 1990s reassessment argued that Kenyon's pottery readings missed forms that pushed the destruction back to around 1400 BCE, aligning with late Bronze Age. Ai's location became a second battlefield. The identified site at Tel shows a city destroyed centuries earlier, with no town to conquer in Joshua's time, causing critics to accuse the text of myth-making. Others propose an alternate site at Khirbet el-Makatir, with evidence of late Bronze occupation, defensive walls, and a destruction around the right window. Azor's burn layer sits securely in late Bronze too, but who lit the match remains argued. Archaeology does not hand out unanimous verdicts. It hands out data points. The text stands tall in that avalanche and claims its own voice. The two can have a hard conversation without flinching. The model of conquest itself carries sparks. Some read Joshua as evidence for a swift, total military takeover. Others see a gradual infiltration and peasant revolt, an upheaval from within. The Bible's own texture complicates simplistic slogans. Joshua 10:11 lists sweeping victories. Joshua 13 and Judges 1 list pocketed enemies not driven out. Hyperbole belongs to ancient Near Eastern war reports, where all can mean every major node, and where a king can claim he exterminated a nation, while survivors appear 2 chapters later. The genre matters, and the Bible is not embarrassed to use ancient literary forms while still reporting history. The book insists on both decisive triumph and ongoing struggle. The land has rest and yet requires courage. The word that raises the hair on modern necks sits in Hebrew letters like a sealed order, harem. The ban, total devotion to judgment. The ethical heat around Joshua often starts here. The text actually demands nuance. The target was not ethnicity. It was entrenched idolatry and practices the law calls abomination, ritual prostitution, child sacrifice, occult rites. The cup of iniquity for the Amorites finally filled up. As Genesis 15:16 foreshadowed, the policy was also not applied to every neighboring people. Deuteronomy 2:3 draws lines around Edom, Moab, and Ammon with instructions to leave them in peace. It also carved a path for any Canaanite like Rahab to renounce idolatry and live. The Gibeonites, through deception and then submission, survived and were integrated as servants at the altar. Even in battle narratives, mercy lives inside justice. The ethical weight does not float away. The Bible does not ask modern readers to enjoy violence. It asks them to trust that divine judgment after centuries of patience and warning is not caprice. It also plants seeds that will grow into enemy love, forgiveness, and gospel mission, showing a narrative arc rather than a flat code. Joshua's structure invites respect. The first 12 chapters take the reader from river to rest, a series of mountaintop events that define identity. Chapters 13-21 catalog inheritance and embed justice and worship across geography. Chapters 22-24 resolve internal unity and renew covenant. It is a perfect hinge between Torah and the books that follow. Moses' farewell in Deuteronomy slides into Joshua's boots. Judges will stagger into compromise. Samuel and Kings will rise and fall under the measurement of the law Joshua inscribed at Ebal. The nation of Israel enters history as a people with land, law, and worship, not as a myth. The narrative emphasizes that Joshua followed everything as Moses had commanded. The book of the law stayed at his side like a field manual. Even the act of writing shows up repeatedly. Joshua wrote God's words in the book of the law. He recorded the covenant. He set up stones as externalized memory. An oral culture carved history onto rock and leather. One more symbol cascade stands out. Stones. 12 in the Jordan and at Gilgal. A pile in the valley of Achor. Great stones sealing the cave at Makkedah. A monument of stones at Shechem under the oak. A plastered altar of unhewn stones at Ebal. Each speaks. Each bears witness. Israel cannot run from memory without tripping over a rock that bleeds history when kicked. The Ark of the Covenant moves like a heart through the book. It halts rivers, sits silent in processions, centers the reading of law, and signals the presence of God in the middle of Israel's march. The real hero of Joshua is not Joshua. The Ark marched first, and the presence of God laid the path. The book regularly states that God gave the land. God fought for Israel. God hardened hearts to bring judgment. God kept his promises, and God gave rest. The human hero fades beneath verbs that name the true author of history. The setting after Joshua echoes backward as well. Gibeon will host the tabernacle in David's day. Saul's attempt to extinguish the Gibeonites brings famine and judgment under David, because oaths matter centuries later. Shechem will split the kingdom under Rehoboam. Shiloh, where the tabernacle sat in Joshua's allotment days, will fall and be used by Jeremiah as a cautionary tale. The decisions in Joshua cast shadows long enough to cover books. Even Joshua's geographical poetry deserves attention. The Jordan stops at Adam, Izarathon, pinning the exact miracle to a coordinate. Gilgal sits by the eastern border of Jericho, its name pulled from the rolling away of Egypt's reproach. The valley of Aijalon sees the moon's place in a long battle. The southern campaign threads through Shephelah towns that later appear in the story of David and Goliath. The northern campaign pinches around the waters of Merom, still visible in Israel's far north. The book paints Canaan with dots that a modern traveler can still visit. The names are old, but the hills remain, the breezes remain, and the stones hold their stories. The book of Joshua does not hide its scars. Subtle admissions break any naive reading. The Jebusites remain in Jerusalem. Canaanites live in Gezer. The tribe of Joseph complains about not having enough land, at which point Joshua tells them to clear forest and face chariots without fear. Israel struggles when the challenge moves from open miracles to long obedience. The echo sits in every heart. It is easier to cheer at a falling wall than to clear a forest in slow faithfulness. Joshua's pastoral brilliance surfaces in these small exchanges. He pushes the tribes toward responsibility rather than feeding their excuses. Courage in this book looks like steady boundary keeping, city building, and law keeping over years, not just one-day heroics on a ridge. The interplay of violence and worship disturbs modern readers precisely because the text refuses to confine religion to inner feeling. In Joshua, prayer opens rivers, altar building seals identity, and public reading of the covenant anchors the nation. Sacred and secular do not part ways. The resurrection of covenant loyalty after wilderness rebellion generates social order. A culture without that anchor disintegrates in Judges. The book warns as much, and the warning lands with fire if the reader proceeds. Even the small beats speak volumes. The manna stopping after the first Canaan Passover signals a divine father teaching children to farm. The rolling away of Egypt's reproach at circumcision signals identity before achievement. The ark, stepping into the river before anyone else, signals leadership that leads with sacred presence, not with numbers. The memorial stones channel teachable moments into tactile objects, because memory requires concrete shape. Every parent in Israel had something to point to when a son or daughter ran their hand over carved rock and asked about wet sand that turned to dry ground in one breath. Memory in Joshua is not a file in the mind. It is a monument under the hand. The names in Joshua carry weight like stone, too. Rahab, Achan, Caleb, Othniel, Phinehas, Jabin. These are not cardboard. Rahab bridges worlds and shames many Israelite skeptics by trusting the God she has only heard about. Achan's coveting turns fashion and bullion into a noose. Caleb's old man courage puts fire into every younger spine watching. Othniel's future as the first judge glints in his capture of Debir. Phinehas transforms from zealot to diplomat in the altar incident, proving that zeal under guidance makes peace. Jabin's name lives on to terrorize Israel later under Sisera, reminding that failure to drive out idolatry creates later tyrannies. The places form a spiritual atlas. Shechem and Shiloh are not just coordinates. They are covenant crossroads. Jericho is a warning and a scar. Ai is a lesson in integrity. Ebal and Gerizim are a classroom shaped like mountains. Azor is a memory of fire that says enemies can look unassailable and still fall. Gilgal is a base of operations and a memory quarry. The valley of Achor is a wound that Hosea will later transform into a door of hope in prophetic poetry. The book's accuracy in place names forms the skeleton of its reliability. It reads less like a fantasy and more like a tour itinerary scratched onto ancient leather. The book's legal streak also stands out. Covenant blessings and curses are not abstract themes. They are legal sanctions. The reading at Ebal and Gerizim mirrors suzerain vassal treaties of the ancient Near East, with preamble, historical prologue, stipulations, blessings and curses, and witnesses. The witnesses in Joshua are stone and sky. The covenant is not a vague spiritual sense of belonging. It is a treaty with a king who saved a people out of slavery and bound them to love and loyalty. And that treaty includes the right of the king to wage holy war against covenant breakers after patience and warning. The harsh edges of Joshua live inside that legal frame. They do not float free. The connection to Jesus by name is not a clever preacher's trick. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, made by Jewish scholars between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE, uses the same Greek name, Jesus, for Yehoshua. The letter to the Hebrews uses this overlap to reflect on the theme of rest. Joshua gave a kind of rest. Jesus offers final rest. The Jordan crossing through an ark-led miracle becomes a living preview of baptism and new creation. The commander of the Lord's army, speaking holy ground words to Joshua, echoes the voice that will later step into a boat and command a storm. The altar at Ebal with uncut stones and law writing finds an echo in a hill outside Jerusalem, where a stone-cut tomb will stand empty. The chord started in Joshua sings all the way through the Bible. Joshua's narrative voice calibrates awe with sobriety. Claims of miracle and precision in place form an integrated testimony. The author lists the 31 kings defeated west of the Jordan in chapter 12 like a ledger. This is not tall-tale bravado. It is a receipt. The clarity about what remains unconquered strengthens rather than weakens the book's credibility. It denies cheap triumphalism. It strengthens hope by telling the truth. Obedience from here on looks like gradual inheritance rather than instant spectacle. The story of the altar at the Jordan teaches a lesson about misunderstanding that every age needs. The Western tribes were ready for holy war over what looked like a rival shrine. Zeal is not the problem. Unchecked suspicion is the problem. Phinehas, famed for decisive action, models measured inquiry. The explanation reveals a godly motive. Unity is preserved. The altar stands as a stone witness rather than a source of smoke that would have split the nation. Joshua's era shows that covenant people can avert catastrophic schism when they prioritize truth, face-to-face conversation, and a shared fear of God. The final pages insist on the sovereignty of Scripture within the life of the people. Joshua writes into the book of the law. The same phrase appears regarding Moses. The chain of writing begins here as a repeated act, not a later invention. The stone at Shechem that heard the vows stands as a credible ancient rhetorical flourish, but also as a reminder that in Israel matter hears and tells. A nation with carved laws and carved memories resists amnesia, and amnesia is the path to apostasy the book warns against with relentless clarity. Joshua is not a tale dropped from nowhere. It is the second half of a single movement with Deuteronomy. Moses' farewell sermon becomes Joshua's field orders. The same emphases echo forward. Be strong and courageous. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Meditate on this book day and night. Keep covenant. Teach your children. Build memorials. Remember, remember, remember. The vantage point of this book sees the promised land not as a theme park, but as a sanctuary and courtroom combined. Blessing exists under law and mercy. Judgment exists under patience and warning. Rest exists through sustained obedience. Hope exists because God makes vows and then keeps them past human failure. In a world wired for spectacle, Joshua's spectacle is not what modern viewers expect. The most consequential scene after the river and Jericho may not be a battle at all. It is the reading of the law between mountains, and the writing of that law on plaster. It is the deliberate mapping of cities of refuge and Levitical towns. It is the quiet casting of lots before the tent at Shiloh. It is the moment an old warrior asks for a hill with giants on it, receives it, and takes it. It is a graveside under a hill in Ephraim, where a man who led a people into promise lies at rest, and where a nation can now walk past with stillness rather than fear. The controversies, the miracles, the stones, the altars, the storms, and the songs of promise all press toward a single admission. Joshua is not primarily about Joshua. Joshua knows this and lives this. The commander who bows before the commander, the leader who keeps the law close, the warrior who pauses for circumcision rather than charging the gate, the conqueror who builds altars at the right mountains, the land divider who frees tribes to take responsibility, the elder who gathers the people to choose loyalty. All of that points away from the man to the God who saves. The book of Joshua is the most eye-opening when it is read as an integrated whole, rather than as a handful of war stories. It is a story about promise and presence. It is a study in memory and justice. It is an atlas that turns into a covenant map. It is a courtroom where witnesses are stone and sky. It is a temple without a roof under which a nation learns to sing, fight, farm, and keep faith. It is an exodus continued, a wilderness ended, and a kingdom seated. It is the thunder of ram's horns and the whisper of law recited to children at bedtime. It is the burn of judgment and the shine of mercy, walking side by side down a dusty road into a land that, despite every enemy, finally becomes home.